Welcome everyone to this Montana Book Festival event, Stories from Our National Forest, a conversation with Greg M. Peters and Timber Press's Will McKay. My name is China Reavers. I am a volunteer host for the Montana Book Festival, and I want to welcome you, audience, into this virtual space from Bozeman, Montana. The Montana Book Festival acknowledges that we are in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish Kootenai, the Appalachia, and Cheyenne people. The Montana Book Festival strives and will continue to strive to help promote Indigenous voices as one of the ways our organization acknowledges and respects the Aboriginal peoples of Bozeman and across Montana. For those of you zooming in from outside of Bozeman, I encourage you to take a look at the link I just put in the chat. Let me throw that in there for you guys. So you too know whose Aboriginal territories you're occupying. Go ahead and let us know where you're zooming in from this afternoon. We're really excited to welcome Greg M. Peters and Will McKay to this year's virtual festival, but first I want to take care of a little housekeeping. We'd like to welcome you as attendees to submit your questions to our authors via the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to use the chat function to talk amongst yourselves while the event is taking place. On the back end, I will be monitoring both the Q&A and the chat for any logistical questions you may have throughout the event. The Montana Book Festival wishes to thank our event sponsors, Arts Missoula, Humanities Montana, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Whitefish Review, and MissoulaEvents.net. With that, I'd like to introduce you to Will and Greg. Greg M. Peters is a freelance writer based in Missoula, Montana. Before writing full-time as a freelancer, Greg was the director of communications at the National Forest Foundation, where, among many other things, he edited the NFF's magazine, Your National Forest, and his writing has appeared in National Parks Magazine, High Country News, Down East Magazine, Big Sky Journal, Outside Bozeman, Missoula Independent, and more. Will McKay is an acquisition at Timber Press. Timber has been operating in Portland since 1978. They publish books that help readers explore the natural world, whether that's in the garden or out in the wild. Will has worked in publishing for more than 15 years and has been at Timber Press for the last 4.5 years. And with that, I give you Greg and Will. Enjoy.
Good morning. Thank you, China, for that introduction. And thank you to Montana Book Festival for having us. This is really exciting. I'm Will McKay. I'm the editor that worked with Greg on his wonderful book, Our National Forests. I've got an advanced copy here. The book is available for purchase on Amazon now, but will be on shelves at November 9th. Everybody at Timber is really proud of this book. Greg did an amazing job synthesizing his compelling writing with a lot of great images and great photos of national forests themselves. And you'll see some of those today in Greg's presentation as we talk in conversation. And I'm really excited to be in conversation with Greg, who is right now in Missoula, the Montana Book Festival's headquarters. And Greg, it's great to see you this morning. And I think we're going to start with a reading from the book, and then we'll get into conversation, and we'll keep an eye on the Q&A. So please, as we go, if you have questions, feel free to type those in. And at the end, we'll save some time, maybe 15 or 20 minutes to get to those questions. So please, as we're talking, feel free to pose any questions that you have, and we'll be happy to get to those at the end. But without further ado, Greg, please.
Thanks so much, Will. And thank you to China for that great introduction, and to Lauren Korn, who's not on the Zoom this morning, for organizing the Montana Book Festival, and for sort of accepting our national forests into the book festival. When I first moved to Missoula in 2007 to go to the University of Montana to get an environmental studies graduate degree, I went to the book festival. There was an event at the Wilma here in town, and one of the speakers was James Lee Burke, who's one of my favorite authors. He just writes some of the most compelling prose you can find. And he was sharing his history of how he became a professional writer. And he was rejected. His first book manuscript was rejected. I think he said something like 140 times before it was finally accepted. He was a high school English teacher down in New Orleans at the time, in his 40s. And it was an inspiring talk for a young aspiring writer, and one that gave me some optimism that through maybe some perseverance and a little bit of hard work, I too might be able to have a book someday. And that opportunity came about in large part due to Will. And so I'm really grateful for all of Will's help and guidance in this process. He'll tell a little bit about, I think, about how how this book idea came to be. But the short version, to steal a little bit of his thunder, is when I worked at the National Forest Foundation, there was a bad fire out in Oregon on the Columbia River National Gorge, Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area. And Will reached out to the NFF following that fire to explore some opportunities about partnering to create a book about national forests. And as the director of communications, that conversation kind of ended up on my plate, and was really fortunate to be able to solicit Will's help in facilitating me to become the author of that book and to be able to write it. So I'm really grateful to Will and Montana Book Festival and everybody on the call this morning who is taking time out of their Saturdays to join us and listen to me and learn a little bit more about national forests, hopefully. So to get started, both I think as a way to introduce myself a little bit and also to introduce our forests and how I came to learn about our forests, which I think is not too dissimilar from how many people come to learn about them. I'm going to read a little bit from the preface of the book. And so I'm also, as Will mentioned, the book has, I think, 150 or so photographs in it, which was a really fun part of the project. It was really cool to go through a bunch of historical photo archives, and then also more current photography, and find a way to really represent visually the amazing landscapes that these national forests have included in them. And so I've pulled about 40 of those photos, some historic, predominantly landscape photos of just the stunning vistas that you can see on these places. And I'm gonna just let that play. And I also pulled the captions from each photo along. So I'm gonna cue that up, and then I'm gonna start reading. And as Will mentioned, we'd love to answer some questions, whether it's about the book, making process or editing. Will is certainly more than willing to and capable of answering questions about that or about national forests, etc. Hope folks have questions, and if there are questions about any of these photographs that you see, where are some of these places located, certainly please ask those as well. So I'm going to get that going, and then I'm going to do a little reading, and then Will and I are going to kind of have a conversation here for the next 40 minutes or so. Thanks again. Okay, hope everybody can see that. Our blue Subaru Impreza rattled up the rutted dirt road, its headlamps piercing the night's darkness. My girlfriend, Chrissy, sat quietly in the passenger seat. I knew she was anxious. I was too. We had no specific destination and drove ever deeper into the dark, with the base understanding that the road led to a national forest. I didn't even know, in any meaningful way, what a national forest was, only that they reportedly allowed free camping and imposed few limits on where you could pitch a tent for the night. The day had been wearisome, and we longed to be out of the car and in our tent. An hour and a half had passed since we had rolled through Billings, Montana, in the waning evening light. We couldn't afford a hotel room in the city and had planned on finding a spot to camp. The ragged gazetteer we employed for our road trip indicated that a national forest lay to the west of Billings, so we took the closest exit and motored into the growing darkness. Eventually, we decided we were on the forest. I can't recall, nearly 2 decades later, which forest we thought we were on, or if we had passed a sign that told us. I pulled over in a turnout that seemed flat enough to accommodate our small tent, and we set up our camp. I do recall waking up the next morning in front of a fence with a green cattle gate. Dried cow patties covered the ground. We hastily packed up and headed back down the road. As often happens, the drive back out of the woods, this time in the soft light of an autumn Montana morning, seemed far shorter than the drive in. Soon enough, we pulled back onto Interstate 90 and continued our trip west to Whitefish, Montana. Since that awkward camp, Chrissy and I have gotten married and moved to Missoula. With that wonderful small city as our home base, we proceeded to spend as much of our time exploring the surrounding national forests as we could. And over the passing years, I've come to understand much more about the 193 million acres of forests, deserts, grasslands, and mountain ranges that comprise the National Forest System. In 2010, I got a job with the National Forest Foundation, a nonprofit chartered by Congress in the early 1990s and dedicated to promoting the health and public enjoyment of these vast lands. I first managed their budding tree planting program, soliciting donations from corporations, small businesses, and individuals before becoming the communications director, a position I held until the final day of 2018. That experience, coupled with our immersion in the incredible national forests that surround Missoula, have provided me with a much richer understanding of our national forests than that awkward camping spot outside Billings all those years ago. It turns out that camping among cow pies wasn't actually my first experience on a national forest. In the early 2000s, I lived in an off-the-grid cabin outside of Girdwood, Alaska. The cabin was one of several that had been built on an old mining claim in the Chugach National Forest. While the land on which the cabin rested, precariously I might add, was privately owned, a few footsteps out the rickety door deposited me on the Chugach proper. It was a wonderful place to live if you were young and hale and undeterred by the cold, a lack of running water, or spotty electricity. However, looking farther back into my personal history, this rustic experience wasn't my introduction to a national forest either. When I was in high school, my parents took our family to Utah to ski at the Alta Ski Resort in Little Cottonwood Canyon. The resort is on the Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest, as is its neighbor, Snowbird, and several other world-class resorts. At the time, I had no idea that they were part of the National Forest System, a fact that did nothing to dampen my wide-eyed enthusiasm. I was completely blown away by the mountains in that canyon. They were so different from the rounded, weather-worn summits of Maine's Appalachian Mountains that rose a couple hours west of the coastal town where we lived, that it took me years to fully realize the extent of my connection to national forests isn't surprising. Many Americans might find themselves confused about exactly what our national forests are and what they mean.
Until now, because of course we have this wonderful book. So that was great, Greg. It's such a great beginning. What I love about the preface is how personal it is, and it really extends for the whole book. I mean, this book is about a big system that is, you know, a government entity, but the book itself isn't dry or institutional history. It's really about people. People are kind of at the center, the people who you know, help manage obviously national forests as staff, but then also advocacy groups, citizens, industry. There's so many different people involved in national forests. I think you really capture that from the get-go and kind of never lose that thread. So that's one of my favorite things about the book, and we get it right away in the preface. But as you kind of alluded to, I think in your opening comments, the book did kind of begin, the book itself kind of began with that Eagle Creek fire in the gorge, which is very close to Portland, where I am right now. And we thought that maybe there was a book there because, you know, folks here in Portland really love the gorge, and it's kind of a beloved destination here, and many people who come to visit Portland always kind of go out and take a look at the gorge. And so when that fire happened, we thought maybe we could say something about this place in a book that could maybe benefit some of the relief efforts. But then as we looked at the specifics of the history of Eagle Creek and the Columbia River Gorge, we realized that it was just one part of a larger story of our national forests. And zooming out, I think we found all these wonderful stories that are in the book. I wonder if you could kind of start by telling us where national forests sort of sit in the realm of all of America's public lands and kind of all that they encompass, because it surprised me with just how much acreage they cover and how it is, you know, they're not just in the Western US, they're all over.
Sure, thanks, Will. Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think in the preface, there's actually 193 million acres of national forests, which is a pretty astounding number. To put that in context and in comparison, I think there's around 87 million acres of national park land. So we tend in America to really focus on national parks, and Will and I will get into this in a little bit, but just from a sheer geographic size, the national forests are basically double the size of national parks. There are additional lands managed by federal land management agencies that are part of our public estate. The Fish and Wildlife Service manages 100 million or more acres of fish and wildlife refuges, and then the Bureau of Land Management manages a couple 100 million acres of land out in the West. So the national forests don't represent the largest type of federal land ownership in the country, but they represent one of the largest types. And they span really from Alaska to Florida. Alaska has 2 national forests, the biggest, actually, I think 2 of the biggest. The Tongass is 17 million acres, which, again, to put things in perspective, that's 7 times the size of Yellowstone, which is about 2 million acres, 2.2 million, I think. So just from a sheer size, I mean, that's just an immense amount of land. In Florida, there's 3 national forests. In Alabama, I think it has the smallest national forest at 11,000 acres, the Tuskegee National Forest. Maine has a little bit of a national forest. Certainly California, 20% of California is covered by national forests. So I think all but 8 states, which I think are Connecticut, Iowa, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Hawaii, Maryland, and Delaware, have some unit of the national forest system in them. And just that name, a unit of the national forest system, I think kind of gets at the diversity of landscapes that these forests represent. They're not all forests, though they're called national forests generally. There are also national grasslands, and those are grasslands. And they have their own really interesting and unique history that I get into in the book a little bit, but they came out of the Dust Bowl and reclamation efforts that were part of the federal government's response to the Dust Bowl under the New Deal, under FDR. And they also, I think that history speaks to another interesting fact about national forests, and that's that almost half of the 193 million acres are actually rangelands, or considered rangelands at least. So they might be trees that are interspersed, forests that are interspersed with grasslands. And so the Forest Service has had a long history of managing rangelands for grazing. And when those grasslands came under its purview in the 1930s and 1940s, it had a history of managing those rangelands. I also think it's pretty interesting that the Forest Service is one of the oldest sort of codified federal land management agencies on the books. The Organic Act of 1897 sort of first set the stage for the Forest Service. The organization was created officially in 1905. The Park Service was created in 1915. So from a federal land management standpoint, the Forest Service and national forests are one of the oldest sort of land designations, or at least land concepts, that we have in the country. National forests are managed for multiple uses, and we'll get into this a little bit more when we start to talk about some of the differences between national parks and national forests. But I think this is a really important point to Will's context, or Will's question: how do national forests fit into the broader scope of public lands? And I mentioned national parks, I mentioned wildlife refuges, I mentioned BLM lands. They're all managed for specific things, different things, as determined by the government and the laws that created them. National forests are managed for multiple uses. And basically each of those uses is considered sort of equal in terms of the management paradigm. So whether it's timber harvesting, mining, grazing, recreation, wildlife habitat, the provision of water to communities, the Forest Service is sort of required to balance all of those uses and manage a finite set of lands to provide for co-equal uses for each of those provide co-equal management for each of those uses, excuse me. So you really find working landscapes in the national forest system in a lot of different ways. They might be working as wildlife habitat for threatened and endangered species. They might be working landscapes that provide water. And there are roughly 3,400 communities in the country, 64 million people that get their water directly from a national forest. And those include big major cities like Los Angeles, Atlanta, Denver, Portland, where Will lives, Missoula, where I live. And so you have all these co-equal uses, you have all these, different management priorities. It's a really complex and really, I think, interesting set of public lands. And I just found them fascinating. And when Will and I sort of started diving into some of this, we pretty quickly realized that, maybe just telling a story about a fire in 2017 didn't quite get us where we wanted to be in terms of helping other Americans better understand what these lands are and why they're valuable and important.
Right. And there is a great chapter about the Eagle Creek fire, but it's just a chapter, and
Yes.
among many great chapters. And the book does do such a great job, and Greg, you do such a great job of showing us that national forest and the national forest system encompass more than just forests. All sorts of different landscapes like grasslands and watersheds. But I also think when we kind of think about the lands that these national forests sit on, we think of them as national forest lands, but really they were obviously inhabited by a wide-ranging population of native and indigenous cultures long before anybody came along to kind of name them something else and kind of manage them the way they are now. And I wonder how native tribes today interact with the national forests and how they have historically. And then you do cover some great ground on that in chapter 4 in the original people's lands. But I was wondering if maybe you could say a little bit more about the kind of relationship that exists there.
Sure. Yeah. And thanks to China for that land acknowledgement at the outset of this program. I think that's really something that we all need to be a bit more mindful of. And I certainly appreciated that. This photo right here that we're seeing is from, that's the Dakota Prairies National Grassland. Excuse me, I got confused. Never mind. I thought it was from the Badger 2 medicine, which I do speak about in the book, and which I'll talk about in just a moment. So that history, Will, is so complicated and so layered, and it's hard to sort of cover in just a few minutes. But at the end of the day, through the treaty making process and through policies, federal policies after the treaty making process, in particular the Dawes Act, Native Americans just lost hundreds of millions of acres of land that they obviously once stewarded. They didn't necessarily have a sense of ownership in the same way that we do today. We thought they owned it. They didn't really, but cultural historians can dig into that a little bit more than we have the time and space for. But at the end of the day, they've lost hundreds of millions of acres of these lands. When treaty making happened, they often, the reservations or their lands that they ceded were much larger than they are today. And then over time, the federal government instituted policies that provided opportunities to privatize lands that Native Americans owned or that the federal government owned in trust for Native Americans. A lot of that opportunity for privatization created further opportunity for the federal government to come in and either purchase or take what were Native American lands post-treaty and incorporate them into the federal estate. And I talk about this in the book a little bit. That wasn't entirely malicious in all senses. Oh boy, I knew this was going to happen. My cat is joining us briefly with me. Get out of here.
Your co-author, right?
Yes. Oh yeah, she helped a lot of extra commas in some of the text. When faced with two opposing opportunities to whether the land that tribes owned was going to be privatized and turned over to timber companies or mining companies or other companies, folks at the time in the early 1900s, late 1800s in the federal government thought, well, we don't want to let private industry come in and ravage these lands. We want to be able to maybe incorporate them into the federal estate and assume some sort of sustainable management on them, some sort of conservation principles on those. So at the end of the day, a lot of the landscape that was originally promised to Native Americans ended up becoming incorporated into the national forest system because there were those two opposing opportunities. It could be privatized through policies that the federal government had set up to effectively privatize Native American holdings, or it could be potentially brought into the federal estate. So that's what ended up happening a fair bit of the time. And that's why a lot of these national forests grew during that time. And I think there's a really great book called American Indians and National Forests that was written by an academic named Theodore Catton out of the University of Arizona. And I would highly recommend folks to read that book. I was a primary resource for me when I was writing that chapter. I learned a ton about this history through that chapter, about the Dawes Act, about assimilation, about all these different ways that Native Americans lost land holdings to private enterprise and to the federal government. So I would definitely encourage folks who are interested to check into that a little bit. Fortunately, things have shifted. It took a long time for them to shift, but they're starting to shift, and they have shifted. Within the Forest Service in 1988, they installed a staffer to kind of be a liaison with tribal communities. That single staffer in 1988 has grown in 2004 into the Office of Tribal Relations, which now is an office within the Forest Service in DC. There are now regional representatives that work with tribes directly. The Forest Service really prides itself on its work with Native American tribes around the country on soliciting their input and on consultation, because a lot of these tribes still retain what they call reserved treaty rights to public land, to national forests. And so from a bureaucratic standpoint, the Forest Service is moving in a positive direction. And there are a lot of, I think, fairly positive stories out there about different organizations like the National Forest Foundation, about new pieces of legislation and that highlight how that relationship is changing and how Native Americans are really reasserting rightfully their control and their desires in managing these landscapes. And one particular example that I highlight in the book is the landscape here in Montana called the Badger 2 Medicine. It's part of the Helena, Lewis, and Clark National Forest. It borders Glacier National Park on the east side, and it also borders the Blackfeet Indian Reservation. And this landscape is effectively their cultural birthplace. And so they have a huge cultural tie, historical tie to this landscape. In the 1980s, under Reagan, Interior Secretary James Watt issued some illegal mining leases on that landscape to mine for oil and gas. Over the subsequent decades, those mining leases were challenged in courts, and finally, under the Obama administration, they were nullified for the final time. That was litigated again by the mining companies. Long story short, today there's an opportunity to fully protect that landscape through a piece of legislation that our Senator John Tester has introduced. And so finally, after decades of federal government making decisions on lands that directly impacted Native Americans, lands that used to be Native American lands that are culturally as important as anything you could imagine to these Native Americans, finally getting an opportunity to protect those lands in a way that they want to. And so I think I'm going to kind of wind this answer down by reading again a little bit from the book. And these are not my words. This is a letter to the editor that was published in the Daily Interlake. It's biting the corner of the book here. It was published in the Daily Interlake, which is a newspaper up in Kalispell near where this landscape is. And this letter to the editor was written by several tribal leaders from the Blackfeet Nation. And I think it's just a really, it really sums up, I think, the history and the, I would say, cautious optimism for the future. And I think is representative of where the Forest Service and National Forests are today in regards to our indigenous cultures. Recently, a panel of judges in Washington, D.C. ruled that the last industrial lease in the Badger 2 Medicine must be canceled. And while the Blackfeet Nation is grateful for the court's ruling, we recognize that this company is not likely to give up. They will be back. And we recognize that, despite the outcome, there were no Blackfeet judges on the court's panel. There were no indigenous attorneys in the room, no Blackfeet jurors. The fate of our traditional territory was, yet again, in the hands of people far away. It is past time for that to change. It is time to make room for the voices of people who for too long have been silenced. It is time to permanently protect our sacred lands in alignment with Blackfeet's vision and tribal interests. That is why we have worked with so many of our friends and neighbors to draft a proposal that will protect the Badger 2 Medicine once and for all. The Blackfeet have been granted a profound connection to the Badger 2 Medicine since time immemorial. It is our last cultural refuge, home to many of our cultural origin stories, a stronghold for our ceremonies and traditions. It is where we practiced our culture and safety after the federal government outlawed Blackfeet ceremony. It is where we still seek healing and solace, guidance and renewal. If our experience teaches us anything, it is that soon someone will bring another fight to our doorstep. Someone always has another plan that will erode our cultural heritage. Our Blackfeet traditional knowledge system is intact, thanks in large part to the Badger 2 Medicine, but it is in fragile condition. It cannot withstand additional pressure. It cannot withstand another fight. Today, we share an opportunity to protect the best of Blackfeet tradition and Montana heritage. The Badger 2 Medicine is, above all else, a place of healing, and our world needs it as much as it needs us.
Thanks, Greg. That's such an important piece of the book and part of the story, and I'm really glad that you included all of that. And obviously, entire books can be dedicated to this subject, but I appreciate you, talking a little bit about it today and including that in the book. One of the, I think, big things about the book and about national forests in general is our perception of and our conflation of national forests with national parks. I think we've often thought that at least on Timber's end that national parks get a lot of the attention. We've seen Ken Burns documentaries, we've seen books come out about national parks, but I wonder if kind of shifting the conversation, if you could highlight the differences between national parks and national forests, because I think even internally, as we were working on the book, people would slip up and say, "Oh yeah, the national parks book that we're working on." No, it's national forests. And you've sort of highlighted the distinctions of usage and recreation that set national forests apart. But what in particular sets them apart from national parks?
Yeah, so when I worked at the National Forest Foundation, we often started conversations with people who are unfamiliar with national forests with, well, they're like national parks, except, and then we'd go on to explain the differences. So I think it's extremely common for most people in America, I would say, to probably sort of lump most federal lands and even public lands into just sort of a public lands and call them parks. I think it's natural. It makes a lot of sense. But there are important differences. And I think to best understand the differences between national parks and national forests, you have to go back a little bit in history and look at two individuals in particular, John Muir and Gifford Pinchot. For folks who aren't familiar with Gifford Pinchot, he was the first chief of the Forest Service. He was a confidant of Teddy Roosevelt. He helped create the Forest Service. He was the first professionally trained forester in America, in the US. He went to Germany actually and studied forestry in Germany, brought those skills back to the United States. He founded the Yale School of Forestry in the early 1900s. So he's sort of this towering figure in National Forest history, Forest Service history, and in what became known and has become known as the conservation movement. So Pinchot embodied a notion of managing public lands, managing the vast landscape that America found itself the owner of after effectively taking it from the indigenous cultures who lived here through policies and war and all sorts of things. And he sort of adapted a utilitarian view articulated by a philosopher from England called Jeremy Bentham about the greatest good. And he is well known for this quote that basically when early Forest Service rangers were faced with decisions on how to best manage the public land, the national forests that they were in charge of managing, they were to sort of think through what would provide the greatest good for the greatest number of people in the long term. So it was really this concept of conservation and this utilitarian concept. So timber could be harvested, water could still be provided, wildlife could still have a habitat, people could still mine, they could still graze, but none of those uses would jeopardize the other uses in concert. But they were very much intended, the landscapes that he managed in the conservation philosophy was very much intended for human consumption in some way, shape, or form. John Muir founded the Sierra Club, sort of this iconic figure in the environmental movement. He advocated for preservation, so effectively walling off in some, figurative sense, large, beautiful tracts of public land, and not having any human interference or human management in those. And so Muir's vision is embodied largely by the national park system. Those lands are set up for preservation, whether it's viewsheds, wildlife populations, recreational opportunities, etc. Pinchot's vision is really embodied by the national forests, where those lands are to be conserved and the resources on them are to be used through a conservation lens. And so I think that's kind of at base the primary difference. There's a notion of preservation that's applied to the national parks. There's a notion of conservation that's applied to national forests. It's a bit of simplified, but generally speaking, that's kind of how most historians and most folks sort of see it. In practice, and partially by the way that the federal government got land and made it part of the federal estate, we find that a lot of national parks are almost entirely surrounded by national forests. I think this is pretty cool, actually. So, the list, Yellowstone is surrounded by 5 different national forests. They make up the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. North Cascades National Park in Washington State is surrounded by the Okanagan Wenatchee and the Mount Baker Snoqualmie. The Grand Canyon on the North Rim has Kaibab, and actually a little bit on the South Rim, there's the Kaibab National Forest. Great Smoky Mountains is surrounded by national forest. Rocky Mountains National Park is bordered. Kings Canyon, Sequoia in California, Crater Lake in Oregon, Glacier National Park in Montana, as I just mentioned, is bordered on multiple sides by national forests. In Alaska, you've got Glacier Bay, Kenai Fjords, Wrangell St. Elias. And so just from a geographic concept, you see these national forest lands being buffers to our national parks. You see there's federal management, there's public input, public process. And so they create both physical and I think sort of cultural and political barriers to and buffers to national parks, which I think is really important. Obviously, wildlife don't recognize human-made borders, and so they wander freely across these landscapes, which I think is really cool as well. So there's, I think, the historical aspect, that preservation versus conservation, and then there's the sort of modern, geographical realities. And then lastly, and I know we got to move on, but I think national forests are a bit more lowercase d democratic. They're a bit freer. There's no gate. There's, most national parks have a gate that you have to go through. That does not exist for most national forests, or any that I'm aware of. The borders are permeable. The regulations are much less restrictive. The opportunities for recreation are much more expansive. You can hunt, you can fish, you can ride off-road vehicles, you can do all these different things on national forests that you cannot do in national parks. And I think that makes them a little more compelling in a lot of ways. National parks are certainly beautiful. I love them. I love visiting them. They represent a lot of what makes America great. But I think national forests also do that in their own way, and they represent, I think, that diversity in America that national parks don't represent quite as well.
You mentioned at the beginning of that great kind of description of the differences, your time at the National Forest Foundation as communications director, where you essentially had to help people understand the differences. And I think that the book obviously does such a great job of showing us what's so special about national forests, and readers have so much, I think they stand to learn so much from it. I wonder, for you working on the book, what you learned, and if there were any revelations for you or anything new that came about as you researched and wrote about national forests.
Yeah. I think two things particularly. I learned a lot about the history of Eastern national forests and how they came under the federal estate, and how that was intrinsically linked to water and the provision of water in downstream communities, and how I mentioned Gifford Pinchot early on. You know, he has a quote, "No forest, no water." And so how early on the Forest Service intimately understood that without forested watersheds, water supplies were going to be severely degraded. And so the formation of those eastern forests to protect those watersheds I think, was a really interesting history that I knew a little bit about, but was able to dive into much deeper through researching the book. And then the second thing that I learned a lot about, and I would argue that probably most people would learn a lot about currently, at least if you went to high school in the 90s like I did, was the history and relationship with Native Americans. That really opened my eye to just how sort of terribly the U.S. treated Native American populations, and how much work we have to do to try to remedy some of those still current scars, or heal some of those still current scars in our country. It was just that history wasn't taught to me in high school. I didn't learn it in college, and so that was a pretty eye-opening thing.
And speaking of sort of suppressed history, at least in the public school sense, you know, Chapter 9 delves into issues of diversity and representation and inclusion in the outdoors, and I think, you know, anyone who's paying attention can see that America's populace is so diverse, and you know, we have such a great diversity of backgrounds in this country, and it's really important, I think, for our institutions to reflect that. And I'm wondering what ways the national forests reflect our diversity, and if you can kind of expand on some of the themes of Chapter 9 in that question, how are national forests sort of reacting to issues of representation in the outdoors, both from a recreational side and from a management side?
Sure. From a management side, I think the Forest Service has long been focused on diversifying its workforce. I get into some of that in the book, both from a gender and a racial concept. Just recently, just a couple months ago, actually, Randy Moore was appointed as the first Black chief of the U.S. Forest Service, which is huge. And it's huge, not just, I think, for the existing staff of the Forest Service, and you know, that of a major federal agency, it's led by an African-American man, but huge for youth and for young people to see somebody in that position rise to such a prominent position in a public land management agency, I think provides them an opportunity to see themselves in that position. And that's a little bit what I focused on in the chapter. And, you know, when we write a book, it is almost immediately dated. And I think some of what I spoke about is really starting to change, at least anecdotally, I'm seeing it. But the representation of diverse people in outdoor media is something that I focused on in that chapter in the book, and I think it's really important, actually. So I think it ties to Randy Moore being, you know, the new chief, but when people from diverse communities, brown and Black children don't see themselves in advertisements, don't see themselves in outdoor natural resources careers, don't see themselves in those places, that makes them seem a little bit off limits to them, or at least like they're not welcome there, or they can't pursue those types of careers, so or those types of recreational activities. And so there are a lot of groups out there right now that are working really hard to change that, both, you know, from sort of your REIs and your Cabela's in their catalogs who are making an active effort, to groups like Diversify Outdoors, social media influencers like Ambreen Tariq with Brown Girls Camping, people, yeah, I think there's like Fat Girls Who Hike book there, excuse me, Instagram channel.
We have a book coming out.
Oh, do you? Yeah, great. Yeah. So
I'm working with,
thank you.
with Summer of Fat Girls Hiking. Yeah, that's a great organization.
Yeah. So there's all these different groups now that are stepping up and kind of recognizing that this has long been a serious challenge. And I also think it's incumbent on the stakeholder groups, that the nonprofits, the industry groups, whatever they might be, to start to diversify their ranks, and they're making efforts to do that as well. It's challenging. It was a struggle that we had at the NFF. Natural resource management, recreation has long kind of been mostly white people and mostly white men, and that needs to change. For me, it comes down to, if we don't have as broad and as diverse a constituency of people in this country who are aware of, somewhat informed about, and engaged in public land management, wherever it is, whether it's their local, county, state, whether they come to it from an environmental justice standpoint, a wildlife standpoint, a recreational standpoint, if we don't have a broad, diverse set of people who are engaged, it doesn't matter how effective the work of a few organizations is, because we don't have that critical mass of people that are engaged. So I think we need, as a country, as a movement, as a conservation, whatever, I think we need to have as many people on our side of any shape, color, size that we can possibly have. And that's kind of how I tried to finish the book, is a bit of a rallying cry to acceptance and to open-mindedness, and to just invite as many people to come in and find their way into these landscapes. And I guess specifically I'll add I think national forests are somewhat uniquely positioned in a lot of ways to be a bit more accessible, to be a bit more open. We use the stat at the National Forest Foundation: 7 in 10 Americans live 100 miles from a national forest. The Angeles National Forest is an hour from 15 million people that live in LA, one of the most diverse cities in our country. There are certainly, transportation barriers, socioeconomic barriers to getting people out onto those landscapes, but those landscapes are there and they're accessible, and you don't have to pay $50 to go through the entrance gate to get onto, like you might in a national park. You can go picnicking. There's so many ways and so many avenues to getting into national forests that aren't quite there for a lot of other public lands. I think they're uniquely positioned to help bring more people into the fold, and that's what I really hope happens. We need it desperately in this country, and we need more people engaged. I think coronavirus and COVID was really interesting. I was writing the book. We were literally reevaluating our relationship with indoors and outdoors as a society through COVID. All of a sudden, outdoor spaces were safer, indoor spaces were less safe. And that's a flip of how we, I think, had sort of seen things up to COVID. And I don't just mean like outdoor cafes and outdoor concerts, but the impact on recreation, outdoor recreation from COVID is massive. People have just spilled out of cities and out of urban centers and out of more rural places into the outdoors. And so I think it's really interesting timing. I think it was just an interesting observation to see how we've really changed our relationship with the outdoors from, I think, an intellectual standpoint, how it became the safe place to be, and immediately sort of that safeness or concept of safety superseded a lot of the other fears and anxieties that people might have had about being outdoors. Maybe you're a little less worried about a bear for example, because of COVID. And so you're willing to take that risk and go outside and be exposed to wind and rain and bugs and wild animals, because that's now all of a sudden a safer alternative to being exposed to a deadly infectious disease.
Yeah, it's sort of a call to the outdoors, and I think through circumstance, if nothing else, but I think the book is such an invitation to get out and to engage with national forests. And I think for as many sort of problems as we see, you do a great job of showing us reasons to be optimistic. And I think the book kind of ends on an optimistic note about where we might be heading. And speaking of ending on an optimistic note, I want to open it up for questions at this point. We do have a great couple of questions in the chat right now. And so if any folks want to add to that as we answer this one from Louis Ulmer in Alaska. Louis asks, first, do you know of any land currently being considered to be established as a new national forest in the US? And secondly, which national forest do you want to visit and what excites you so much about it? So I would assume that would be one that you haven't been to. Unfortunately, we didn't give you a travel budget to go to all of them. I'm sorry about that. We just couldn't find the money. But yes, to Lewis's first question, do you know of any land currently being considered to be established as a new national forest in the US?
I do not. That doesn't mean that there isn't. It just means that I don't know about it. There are, so the Land and Water Conservation Fund is funded by offshore oil and gas receipts and taxes on those. And that entire program is set up to expanding access and ownership, federal ownership of lands. And so there are a lot of smaller parcels in holdings, checkerboard pattern in holdings across the West in particular, where land and water conservation funding is being utilized to purchase and add to the federal estate, national forests, national parks, wildlife refuges, et cetera. I don't know of a specific, spot where a new national forest might be created. The most recent one I think that I know of is probably MIDEWIN National Tallgrass Prairie in Illinois, which is a really interesting spot that I focus on in the book as well, where there was a former Department of Defense munitions factory that was decommissioned in the 1990s, and through some legislation and some community input in Illinois and at the federal level, about 20,000 acres of that former DoD site was transferred to the Forest Service to create a national tallgrass prairie. And so they're in the process of restoring that now. And that was in, I think, 1996 when that happened, or sometime in the mid 1990s. So it might happen. With 193 million acres, if you add 20,000 acres to it, it doesn't really affect the number all that much. So, I think while some of these examples might be very small and discrete, they may not impact, the overall breadth of the national forest system. But to those, 4 million people or 2 million people that live in Chicago, having a new 20,000 acre public land site an hour out of Chicago is a pretty big deal. And there's bison there and there's trails there and it's a pretty cool spot. So, I think these things can make a bigger impact locally than maybe they do nationally. To your second question, Louis, I've never been to the Tongass. That place just looks absolutely amazing up in Alaska. It's just massive. It kind of combines a lot of the landscapes that I like, from coastal, to glaciated mountains. And I'm actually pretty intrigued by the national forests of the Midwest, the northern Midwest, the Superior. I really would love to get onto the Boundary Waters Wilderness Canoe area, Chequamegon, Nicolet, all those forests up there, the Hiawatha, those older hardwood forests in the Midwest, I think are pretty captivating as well. Great question. Thank you.
Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat at this point.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, I don't think we have any questions left in the chat or in the Q&A. I just wanted to extend a huge thank you to Greg and Will for coming today. Greg, your passion for the outdoors and just sharing your thoughts about the changing social landscape of our national parks and access has been just really fascinating. So this has been a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank everyone watching and participating. You've been great. Thank you also to our event sponsors, Arts Missoula, Humanities Montana, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Whitefish Review, and MissoulaEvents.net. Just a reminder, you can purchase Greg's wonderful book and books by many of our other authors at Fact and Fiction Books. Be sure to enter. Yes, I love that you're both holding up copies. Be sure to enter the code MBF when you check out on their website, or you can vocally say the code MBF the store if you're in store. I also urge you to purchase Montana Book Festival merchandise at montanabookfestival.com. There you can also donate so that we can continue our programming after the festival this year. So thank you again, Will and Greg, and thank you everyone. Have a great rest of your weekend.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you, China.
Thanks, China. Yeah.